Good evening, dear colleagues. We're pleased to welcome you to Positive Hack Days business track. I'm sorry it's getting late. So today, rather tonight, we want to discuss how open source code can support cyber sovereignty. We have a very unusual panel of speakers today. We have Kirill Severgin, I'm sorry if I mangle your name, who is head of Alrosa Competence Center for Data Management. We also have Vladimir Vavra, head of data infrastructure at Uralhim. Sergey Zolotarev from Arena Data is not here, I'm told. Okay. I haven't got a speakers. Oh, Sergey, you're here. I'm sorry. And he's the founder and director of strategic development. So Arena Data is with us. Alexander Gutin from Astra. That's the person who has not made it here. Ivan Panchenko, who's deputy CEO of PostgreSQL, is with us. A pleasure to have you. And Konstantin Osipov, the co-founder of Pika Data, but everybody knows him as the person behind Tarantula. So we're here to discuss various issues related to open source code. So much gets said about this subject, but I'm wondering if you, gentlemen, have felt that over the past year, due to the how shall I best put it? Oh, the well-known developments, the interest in open source data has been on the rise. Is that really true? Do we have real evidence of that, of vanilla or commercial adaptations of open source code actually making the rounds in the industry, so to speak? The past year has been the year of removing the masks, both in terms of the end of the pandemic, but also in terms of many things that have been hidden becoming evident. You know, lots of companies before that said, well, we are using open source and we're not we're not afraid of that, or we're not ashamed of that. Now, what we're seeing right now is an extension of a pretty long trend. I think it's impossible now for companies not to recognize they're using open source code, because what else can they do? However, what still needs to be done is sort of institutionalizing it and making sure that everybody is okay with that. You know, whatever we're seeing internationally and in particular in Russia is, if you like, an attempt to link open source code usage with the bureaucratic requirements imposed by the state. Do we have other comments?
На самом деле, да, дополню Ивана.
Let me build on what Ivan has just said. Numerous projects we have seen over the past several years. We do develop lots of projects based off open source. We are certainly seeing great demand for what Postgres is doing, Postgres community. Now, system development, where the effort required to develop a new piece of software is colossal. You simply cannot develop a new product if you have a team of, say, 300 people in a year on your hands. So it's only natural that most companies have recognized that open source is the silver bullet under the current conditions. So we can actually develop good products to replace well-known vendor solutions based off available open source systems. I like how Vanya put it. The time to tear the masks off. Indeed, we have seen a dramatic change in attitude to open source. We are seeing open source getting very prevalent. in the corporate IT landscape. I do agree that the attitude to open source has become much more loyal lately. It used to be a very rare thing, but not anymore. Today, for so many projects, companies will use open source solutions. They can, in fact, be the very foundation for major projects. Great, thank you, German.
Open source, он, скажем так, достаточно долго был мифологизирован и
Open source has been the stuff of myths for quite a long time. And it has been an area that was sort of ideological. So usually when people hear open source, they believe it's always free, right? But it doesn't have to be this way, right? There are commercial vendors who are basing their products off open source. What business models do you think can be effective in the long run in this industry? Now, we are doing cybersecurity, and in the cybersecurity area, there is so much open source. Lots of great Russian developers, grab some open source, they tweak it somewhat, put their logo on top of that, and they sell it, and there is nothing shameful about it. So you do get, the engine of somebody else, but then you add your own signature database, which is fine. Now, can you actually build a vanilla system for a large enterprise? Is that okay, do you think?
Наверняка есть еще промежуточные модели с
And there must be some models in between, right?
технического использования.
Ну, вы знаете, вы правы, да, наверное, две основных модели.
I guess you're right. And these are the two chief models we're seeing in Russia. One is when you have a large enterprise creating a large competence center. It may very well be enshrined in their IT strategy. It's not, just a matter of feasibility for them. It's a strategic thrust. So they have taught lots of people, and they are using mostly open source software. And the second model, used by many people present on the stage here, is when you commercialize open source software. We try taking our products to Europe. We talked to partners there. And we were told that the second model is totally improper there. We're told that clients in Europe want to buy consulting and services for the vanilla open source. I don't really see how they want to do that, but that's their position.
Okay, я хотел бы начать с того, что
Let me start.
Мне очень интересно, что такое Free as and Beer Open Source, потому что я свой первый коммит сделал 21 год назад в открытый проект.
That I'm really interested in what is free as beer open source. My first commit to an open source project was 21 years ago, but it has never ever been altruistic for me. This whole idea of open source being driven by people in their spare time, developing new things, I think it's all a myth, really, concocted by people who don't want to pay. And, well, there must be people like this, but I don't think that they cover more than 1% of the population. I do believe that open source is a commercial industry, first and foremost. Monetization of open source starts when
условно говоря, открытые версии
someone takes a publicly available version of a product, and there will be a vendor or a foundation of vendors, as in the case of Apache, behind it. And they will be selling their services, their consultancy, or maybe a private license to use it. Contrast it with a single vendor who will publish the source code of their software as a way of ensuring assurance.
Вендором что-то случится, такой бас-фактор,
You know, in
эти
case,
исходники никуда не
sometimes they call it bust factor. So in case something happens to this vendor, this is the source code,
И
so you can still manage your system, so to speak.
это экспертиза сегодня, да, то есть
And the most important thing, in my opinion, is expertise. There is intellectual property,
продукта, знание проблематики,
there is product knowledge, knowledge of
они идут за
the customer pain point, so to speak. And naturally, all clients want the expertise.
Где его драйвер? Драйвер — это экспертиза поставщика.
And I think that this whole sector is driven by the supplier
В самой компании, если это крупная компания,
expert knowledge.
но с экспертизой-то у нас и
It is
проблема.
not
Глобально,
distributed equally.
да? И
And I do believe that globally this market does not have enough expertise.
вот во всех этих
Hence the importance of vendors of open source software.
которые мы каждодневно используем, невозможно в них...
Well, take, for example, the products that we use on a daily basis. We cannot be experts in them all. We cannot really know the details of so many DBMSs or operating systems.
Каждую...
Well, so many people here use Linux systems pretty much every minute. Do we all know how Linux kernel works? I guess nobody here knows that.
Коммерциализация, она идет за...
So I do believe that it's a commercial sector,
Это нужно смотреть.
and it's driven by the expertise of suppliers and vendors. This should be the most important criterion, in my opinion, the most important yardstick
И так далее.
when you choose to work or not to work with a particular piece of software or vendor.
Много сказали, я сейчас еще в ту же кучу.
Now, Sergey and the others have already said a lot. Let me build on that.
Высказывания
There is this saying
значит, основатель.
belonging to academician Ivannikov, the founder of the Institute of Systemic Programming.
Что-то ему отдать.
And he said that before you take something from open source, you gotta give something to open source. And this is the reality.
Это своя экспертиза, а это только
You either need to prove that you're an expert,
собственно разрабатывать.
which is commits, right? Or you need to give money to the developers.
Участвуешь сам в разработке open source.
There's no going around it. You either become an expert and you participate in the development,
Здесь разные
or you buy this expertise one way or another.
либо
And there are different ways of funding it. It can be a license-based model where a vendor will sell a license for their product,
которые вот
or a service-based model like what Sergey said, where this model seems to work very well, unlike Russia. Actually, in Russia, outsourcing seems to be struggling, generally speaking. And this is partially, at least, due to the colossal lack of trust in the Russian society, which goes back many decades, and therefore it is pretty difficult to change. So license model works much better in Russia.
оплачивает человек.
And let me repeat after Konstantin, the users do pay for the real expert knowledge, standing, so to speak, behind this software.
Важно, что действительно существует такая ошибочная совершенно концепция, что можно просто
There is this erroneous idea that you can grab open source software
свободный софт
and apply it just like that.
разрабатывался
Open source software, unlike commercial software,
принципом.
was developed in line with different principles. One of them being
То есть
distribution of labor and high specialization in narrow subject matter expertise areas.
взять,
Take, for example,
обладая сравнительно
large companies like Microsoft or Oracle.
решение всегда, ну, может быть, до последнего.
They have not exactly a one-size-fits-all solution, but implementing their solutions
Компоненты. Это
takes
хорошо проработано.
relatively less amount of knowledge.
Их надо
With open source software, you need to know a lot in order to concoct a system that will meet your personal needs.
Он не подходит. Такие эксперименты
And you cannot just shoot from the hip. You know, this country certainly had its own share of experiments where a major, say, plant decided to implement an open source system very quickly, and they zeroized their IT budget.
увольнением того, кто все это придумал.
It all ended with the CIO being fired.
Не панацея. Это не то, что можно просто взять
Open source is no silver bullet.
целый такой сложный культурный слой, в котором надо еще разобраться.
It's a culture, among other things, and it needs some mindset shift. Funnily enough, the Ministry of Digital Transformation website still has this erroneous publication on their website about the 4 advantages of open source. That it's, it's free, just go and use it. It's safe because open source code is available. It's neither.
С другой стороны, за тех коллег, которых, наверное, здесь
Let me put it slightly differently.
вендоры и потребители. Но
Now, I'm saying primarily vendors and users here, but I do believe there is a different class of software,
то есть
and I believe it only emerged over the past several years.
собственно,
Now, I'm talking about large companies that had their own IT subsidiaries that invested in the development of their own software. Now they have started offering their software as open source.
называю попытка, давайте мы монетизируем то, что мы вкладываем.
I think that was an attempt by them to monetize what they have been investing in for so long and see if anybody wants to buy it.
Коллег.
I think it must have been a very courageous decision for them.
Труд и компетенции, которые говорили здесь коллеги,
But on the other hand, the labor and the competences that were required to develop that stuff, they were all there. And my wish to them
руки
is once they've embarked on this journey, that they continue it.
не дойдет до финиша, а кто-то
I realize some of them will be more successful than others, and some companies will make it big.
как я услышал, да, пожелайте, наверное, удачи.
So my wish to this third group is that of success, because this paves the way to more competition. I certainly want to wish success to these companies as well, but my logic is different.
Участники открытого рынка открытого ПО,
Many participants of the open source software market
развитие и создание
don't really appreciate how much it costs to develop open source software.
это гораздо проще.
We all know that writing stuff from scratch is much cheaper than tweaking something that's already in existence. The difference between them
Это как раз вот очень интересное свойство нашего.
is measured in numerous x's.
У нас поменялось то, что у нас стало гораздо
So what has changed is that we now have many more pioneers in the market of open source software.
пионером, мне Сергей сказать.
Oh, right, Sergey is telling me that today is the day of the pioneer organization, like Soviet Boy Scouts.
Взять что-то, значит,
Some people believe that open source software is easy. All you gotta have is just a handful of experts.
там, поддержка,
However,
миграция клиентов,
you also need to do client support, migration, development. You also need to support, so to speak, the competitive advantage you have in the market. The open source market is actually pretty small. We are like 1% of the global IT market.
огромное количество лиц.
Open source software around the world is attracting lots of eyeballs. In order to stay competitive,
Наши усилия для того, чтобы
we need to consolidate our efforts
чтобы у нас получалось хорошо.
in order to be successful at what we do.
Пройдем. Именно
I do hope we are going to finish this journey, or at least this leg of the journey, and we will learn how to share our contribution
у нас
rather than monetizing, rather than saying, how about you buy it from us?
сообщество.
But I'm talking about sending patches to vendors, suggesting patches to the open source community, collaborating in various ways.
более широкое
And
сообщество.
I'm afraid we still don't have this culture. It still needs to develop. And I'm talking about the whole community, not just those vendors.
Давлеет у нас такой вендорский взгляд, да, о том, какие мы
I
хорошие,
think that this stage is dominated by vendors,
софт и так далее, да, но я
and therefore there is a lot of chest thumping here involved.
сразу вернуть про облако, насколько оно здесь поможет.
Now,
тем вот
let me go back to what you said previously about whether cloud can change anything. Now, put yourself in the shoes of consumers.
да, в Европе предпочитают
Now, there was this interesting idea that Europe preferred
объяснять и так
OPEX
Вот
to
с точки
CAPEX.
зрения того, кто
While in Russia, people love going for licenses. They don't really like operational expenses.
какого-то коммерческого open source. А вот вы наверняка набили много шишек.
I guess you've learned a lot in the school of hard knocks. You must have made a bunch of important conclusions about what works and what doesn't, which models apply where. Would you like to share some of your learnings of this kind?
Металлургический завод, решил не на ваниле, да, строить все завтра, а как-то потихоньку в эту историю начать играть.
Because who knows, maybe metals plant will want not a forklift upgrade, but a smooth transition to open source.
Свою инфраструктуру, свое решение по управлению.
Now, when we started developing our infrastructure for data management,
Ходя на проектирование, стали понимать, в какую инфраструктуру
when we just started designing it all,
что мы идем в гибридную
we
инфраструктуру.
realized that we wanted to have a hybrid infrastructure.
Дополнительные сложности ввиду того, что необходимо
And we knew that this hybrid infrastructure would be quite complex because
инфраструктуре.
it would require some balancing of on-prem and cloud-based solutions.
Решением, которые,
And it was also clear that we were going to prioritize freely distributed open source solutions.
сервисы и
Some of them are available from the cloud,
из того,
but
что в целом
not necessarily so.
из-за того, что на рынке было очень мало пригодных для нас решений, мы
Given that there were very few solutions in the market that would seem to work for us,
экспертизой подняли, разработали. Но сейчас
we decided to rely on some proprietary self-grown systems
даем
that represented our own expertise.
понятие того, что нам нужны,
But now
которые будут поддерживаться, которые будут
we are coming to rely more on external service because we understand that we need to have systems
отдаем на поддержку.
that will run in this hybrid manner, and we want to have external support
И
that will come with SLAs and will give us some
не заниматься тем, что мы
peace of mind.
версии, которые размещены в разных облаках между собой и выравниваем наш собственный процесс. Я думаю, что
And by doing this, we're trying to streamline our own processes. I think this is the future.
Для нас, наверное, мне тоже будет сложно ответить полноценно.
It will be pretty difficult for me to give you a
Мы как компания с госучастием,
full-fledged answer. Alrosa is a partially state-owned company, and until recently, we've been operating in a very different paradigm.
то мы
So when we finally had to start looking into all that, we realized there were so many limitations imposed by the Ministry of Digitalization. For example, they said we cannot use really the classic open source. We can only use the open source software that's listed in the ministerial register.
С другой стороны,
And I realized that it's not really a common constraint for many other companies.
устоявшееся мнение, что госкомпании
There was also this
не могут быть в облаках.
prevalent opinion that state-owned enterprises cannot afford to be cloud-based.
И мы нормально
Not really our case.
дружим, и у нас нет вопросов. Поэтому, когда перед нами стал такой вопрос, а будет ли у нас облако,
So when this question first emerged, like, are we going to have cloud-based systems, we said, for sure.
мы в процессе, скажем, утверждения проекта.
Well, right now,
В нашей архитектуре запланировано, что мы используем одного облачного провайдера, который уже давно на рынке.
we are looking for a particular solution. We have decided to turn to a particular vendor that has been around for a long time, and we believe they have the required level of maturity
Что мы хотим.
that will enable us to get exactly what we want.
Продолжаю общаться с коллегами.
And I personally continue talking to my colleagues on, the
Получил
side, so to speak, of other providers because I want this market to develop.
в одну банк тоже не положишь все. И
Well, you don't want to put all your eggs, in the same place, and we do want to see more competition and more diversity. We want other cloud providers to be able
мы называем,
to provide managed services.
для нас вот это важно, что а насколько мы получаем
That's really important to us.
услугу.
We want to have a holistic service.
Функциональщиком, и, к сожалению, там не всегда обладая компетенцией, а как это на уровне ЦОДа работает и так далее.
I'm more a functional guy, so I don't know that much about data center operations. That's why I prefer to have it as a managed service.
Управление.
So I see that the market is growing, the market is developing, that, we maintain a pretty good dialogue.
Не говорит, что мы все в облако положим. У нас действительно есть данные, которые мы не можем вынести за периметр компании.
And for sure, we do have some data we won't take off the perimeter of the company. That's why we do have an on-prem system, and thus this means that we have a hybrid infrastructure.
Время возможности ошибиться.
I think that what we have right now is a time when we can afford to make mistakes.
Все, это наше решение. Надо пробовать.
I think now is the time to experiment and try things. We need to talk to more colleagues, to more potential vendors,
Сервисы для того, чтобы
and sometimes help them improve their services to elevate their game and the game of the whole market. Let me chip in real quick.
Два раза это прозвучало. Я, если честно, большой фанат облаков, особенно для таких...
I'm a big fan of clouds, and you've mentioned clouds twice already. I'm a big fan of cloud services for the public sector. Like, we do have so many executive bodies, and they all seem to believe that they need to have everything on-prem. Well, they don't, and usually don't have the right competences in the regions. This makes me think of two things. One is that, the companies have contributed a lot to their own open source systems and do not become vendors. Maybe they are not trying to, maybe they are not succeeding. So they may say, okay, I've developed my own open stack, I added some elastic to it, and I'm offering it now as a managed service. So you do know the kind of companies I'm talking about. On the other hand, for open source vendors, cloud installation can be a good platform, right? Like, we can be offering our service as a managed service, and that sounds like a good proposition to clients. I personally would be interested in something like this. We are constrained by Federal Law 223, which governs procurement. So buying separately licenses and data center services is too painful. I absolutely want to have a single contract. I think that this discussion is totally orthogonal to open source or non-open source code. What does it matter what kind of license it comes with? Classic open source is difficult to marry, so to speak, to clouds. What I say quite often is that, lots of people use it, some contribute, some want to change the software, others do change the software, and this way open source software keeps developing. This is how most open source products have been developing before clouds came to the fore, because in the cloud you can use it, but you can no longer change it. That's why some open source developers are no longer allowing their software to be used in the clouds, because they want to maintain their open source development model. Let me continue talking about our pain point.
В облаках, да, действительно, часто размещаются open-source решения, которые продают.
Indeed, open source solutions offered as services are often positioned in the clouds, and as users of this service, what we see, and this again harks us back to our problem. Now we do have a more modern version, and the cloud service provider is offering a more outdated version, and they don't update it as fast as we want.
На конкретном облаке, либо мы начинаем диверсифицировать.
So it sort of forces us to either change the cloud service provider or go for multi-cloud operations.
представители облаков предоставляют гораздо больше, лучше.
where we will go, for the best offers from different cloud service providers, which is not bad. I mean, that would be a sign of stronger competition.
которые основаны на
And if we're talking about various components based on open source solutions, I think most companies
решения, и здесь такая
are in fact offering very similar things. And we, as consumers, can only benefit from this quite healthy competition.
Было упомянуто про предоставление открытого ПО в облаке как услуги. Вот было
Okay, you've mentioned provision of open source software through the cloud as a managed service. But you also complain that what some providers are offering is not the newest version, but apparently it's not the same across the board.
очень важную
And also Ivan previously
связь, которая прерывает
mentioned this positive feedback which no longer works in the clouds. I think that if you combine these three ideas, it will mean
который фактически собирает у себя и предоставляет как сервис открытое ПО. Не
that neither the cloud service provider nor you guys as users
то есть
have proper control of your destiny.
что у вас за сценарий, да, происходит? Для каких
And I wonder what kind of scenarios you have. Like for some business process, for some data types, that's fine.
коммодитизируются IT-услуги в
What we see is that IT services are getting more and more commodity-like.
обратная связь, о которой говорил,
This positive feedback
которая позволяет open source развиваться,
does exist in the open source industry and helps it develop.
не контрибьютит в open source, она же не ушла, да, то есть
This positive feedback is not gone because you have clouds.
развиваться под
Open source software continues to develop.
оно само себе
It continues to develop along the same trajectory it chooses. Some companies,
кто-то этого даже не стал
bar cloud service providers from using their software.
это то, что чего мы сегодня не видим
Others don't.
за горизонт.
The most important thing we don't see today, what's beyond the horizon, is what's going to happen to this industry tomorrow.
Лакмусовые бумажки экспертизы, то можно совершенно
And I think that the litmus test here is the test of expertise. I believe that the cloud service providers that do not have the expertise, they won't be afloat tomorrow.
Наоборот, все-таки услышать
Or the other way around, they may listen to us.
есть, и вот
I do believe that, importantly, we have collaboration, or at least interaction.
получить.
Now, what you guys have described is not really the issue we experience. Maybe they don't run head over, they don't, rush to address every request that we have. They may take some time sometimes, but they do meet us halfway.
Те, которые делают там коммерческие решения или коммерческий open source, о том, что вот
Now, vendors providing commercial solutions often say that vanilla open source available on GitHub
тут, если ты покупаешь
is kind of nobody's business. Nobody's responsible for it. And they say, but when you buy a license for a commercial software, a commercialized open source software, the vendor will be sharing responsibility with you. They become kind of committed to you.
звук или IT.
I would love to hear now from users of IT services or IT products.
С другой стороны,
Is that really true? Because on the other hand, I've already heard
со стороны вендоров, что
comments from vendors
коммитменты пытаются записать слишком много.
saying that, it is normal to commit if you sign a contract, but sometimes they see their clients trying to inflate those commitments.
Скажем так, технологическая
There is technological responsibility,
ответственность
operational,
нормальная.
and legal.
Иногда случается так, что люди берут на себя юридическую ответственность,
What happens quite often is
не могут ее нести.
people assume legal responsibility when they don't have the technical capability. They just hope they will get lucky.
Покупаете
Some of them do.
open source у вендора,
So when you buy an open source based product from a vendor, that doesn't really mean that this particular vendor can fix it if something goes wrong. If you're buying a proprietary commercial product from a vendor, well, that doesn't really mean that they will be able to live up to the SLAs you sign with them. I actually don't think there is this dramatic difference between proprietary and open source solutions along this line. You will see dramatic difference between open source software solutions. In fact, the range there is bigger than between open source and proprietary systems. You know, you have well-known corporations behind certain open source products, and they may be like the main contributor to development. For example, there is Terraform, backed by Haishi of Japan. We all know they don't really love Russia, but we keep using Terraform because it's so good. Or there is Angie-INX, which has an American company backing it, but they also have lots of developers. They used to have lots of developers in Russia. Or take MongoDB, which is backed by an international firm, and the community there plays an important role. Or take MySQL, which combines Oracle with a strong community. And there is a great project backed by a great person named Monty, where he sort of single-handedly makes all the strategic decisions. And there are projects backed by community, and you cannot identify a single company that would be calling the shots. And if a question arises, like who can stop me from using this software? Well, no one can. Well, maybe a nuclear bomb can stop you from using their services. So open source comes in different shapes and sizes. Well, check out the queen of open source, the kernel of Linux. Who owns it? Who contributes to it? You know, it's like a watering hole. So many animals come to that particular spot, and they do have a truce. I mean, most animals, herbivores and carnivores, tend to behave themselves, though some animals do get eaten from time to time. So I don't think you can apply a one kind of size-fits-all here. You know, when the Russian government decides to legislate in this industry, it also tends to forget that open source is a very varied industry. Same applies to corporations. You can hardly have a single policy for open source software, even more so for the public sector, otherwise you won't be able to use it effectively. The position of users is particularly interesting, in my opinion. Is there responsibility out there, or are we inventing it? In order to have a product that's really reliable, we need to have collective responsibility. Because, I mean, you can try and hope that you'll pass the buck to the vendor, but will they always be there to protect your back? I'm not so sure. So we need to keep looking for architectural solutions, some early pilots that should help us identify where we're veering off the right track for using a particular product. You know, sometimes, vendors want the best for you, but then you start abusing the product or using it for the wrong kind of purposes. It makes no sense to blame it on the vendor. I think it's ultimately a matter of the budget that you have, isn't it? IT teams in large industrial companies, they mostly consist of people responsible for maintenance. Right? It's not develop, it's a run kind of work.
И никогда
And for business,
в этом случае IT,
they believe it's an important better support function.
которая может
And they can hardly give them substantial budget. So hiring a team that can address any problem whatsoever
для меня это просто
would seem to be too costly. Like, I represent a large company,
сообщество,
but I don't see how my business would give me the amount of money I need
защита,
for,
мне позволяет
being totally self-driven. But having recourse to the community, I feel very comfortable because I know I can rely on the community. Well, this way you can actually extend your arms and enlarge your brain with the help of the community. Absolutely.
Но это
And it's very important for my team to be able to do many of these things.
все-таки ниже люди там, чем
But you know what? In terms of the salary expectations, the people I hire,
энтузиасты, да, такие тоже.
they are either enthusiasts. We do have some very talented and very enthusiastic people, but we pay them less than vendors do.
В принципе, любой вендор заинтересован, чтобы у клиента была профессиональная.
I think every vendor wants the client to have a professional, qualified team.
Новый баг-репорт, что сломалось, им должны...
Well, if they want to get your bug reports, right, and they want to be assured that these bug reports are valid.
в одном и том же. Чтобы
So the vendor and the client want the same thing. They want the client to have a professional team, and the professional team can address more problems. But at the same time, they wouldn't be able to solve all the problems because otherwise they wouldn't need the vendor. If it's very professional, you can cherry pick him as a vendor.
К вопросам от наших
My next question,
зрителей.
and after that we'll turn to questions from the audience.
Что вот с базами данных
Judging by our composition here, I am guessing that commercial open source and databases seem to be doing fine in Russia, but which niches, which niche segments are struggling in your opinion?
давно уже
Now, Alt Linux, Arena Data seem to be taking care of operating systems.
действительно есть нормальные мировые решения.
DBMSs seem to be pretty good. Which areas do you think are struggling in Russia?
Поддержки. Вот где нужно подкрутить?
Where do we need to make an extra effort as a country?
Я тут тоже скажу про нашу боль и как раз продолжение,
Let me tell you about our pain point
продолжая это,
and piggyback on what you said about databases.
которые предоставляются по качеству данных.
Databases are all very well, but when it comes to data quality and data protection,
Решения, которые
I'm talking about masking, for example,
возможность злоумышленникам
we're not happy with what we see.
в базы данных данные как-то умыкнуть.
So, for example, protecting the data that's already, properly positioned in databases from threat actors is not properly done.
Уметь с другим.
All this diversity,
Потому что вот у меня
I want the diversity of great products and services we have in this market to finally learn how to talk to each other. I have this feeling that we're taking great strides forward, but we never stop to take a look at what the neighbors are doing. And some of them
пользуюсь
have started out on the same journey earlier than we did,
еще
and we can learn from them.
такой большой путь, который придется всем пройти.
I actually feel it's a long journey.
Делать вместе, находить решения, чтобы
So I think we need to do it together. We need to look for solutions that would work.
То есть вроде как все работает, да, но пока никто не знает, как оно на конкретно.
Many products seem to work very well, but we don't really know how they're going to fare in a particular environment,
Самая большая беда.
on a particular scale, like scale of Alrosa. I hope that together we'll be able to address this issue.
Иногда вендорам приходит работать в шизофрению, выступать и потребителям, когда ты идешь в комплекс.
Vendors often get schizophrenic because in tenders we often become not just vendors but also consumers, because they will tell us, customers will tell us, we need certified Usher with certified hypervisor and so on and so forth. And then very quickly, although we are vendors ourselves, we become
Сейчас это уже можно сказать?
consumers as well. Well, but
Все уже можно сертифицировать.
all this stuff can be certified now.
Почтовых там и так далее, да, там.
Well, the big question is what kind of patches will be there, but the procedure for certification is indeed
Я
clear.
хочу сказать, что есть, на самом деле, то, что в России происходит с открытым софтом, оно
You
отражает...
know, what's happening in Russia with regard to open source software reflects some global trends, though not in all respects. And there are areas where open source software applies well.
Системы.
Well, for example, nowhere in the world can you find a high-quality open
Система, она не open source.
source software for accounting
Вот, поэтому
or great open source software for ERP. And Russia is no exception. We do have our good systems for that, and they are not open source by any means.
в мире продвинут.
There are some very interesting niches
Две причины, почему так.
where Russia lags behind. There are two reasons for that. A, we have some great teams that made great successes with their products outside Russia. I'm talking Parallels, for example,
Уже сегодня
and NGINX, that has been mentioned earlier today.
убрался. Например, есть
But we also have areas
Sonjo Open Office.
such as LibreOffice or OpenOffice, a great product which is used a lot in Russia. It's part of all Russian Linux systems and assembly, so to speak, and they assume some responsibility for supporting it.
Ну, если не
But in terms of developing it,
Фаренгейта.
pretty much nothing is done around it.
Хотя, казалось бы, продукт практически на каждом десктопе есть.
Although it is a very important product, supported by most Linux desktops, but at the same time, we don't seem to have developers for it. I would see it as a nationwide risk. My Office is a very good product. I'm not saying it works very well,
Совершили
but
огромный труд,
I do believe that the people who developed it did a great thing, and given the amount of time they invested in it,
А было бы здорово, если бы LibreOffice был российский.
they've made a lot of progress. And for obvious reasons, it's not an open source software. No browsers. The browsers are Russian, but the kernel is not Russian
Такая проблема. Поскольку
by far. And that's a major issue.
со свободным ядром,
Because browsers you will find everywhere.
да, наша компетенция в нем, она
I think that our competences when it comes to browser kernels, as a country, I mean, are very low.
компиляторы, интерпретаторы.
Now, compilers and interpreters,
Contributed в компиляторы, как
we certainly have our own PhDs. I'm sorry, we have Aspirant, the company, contributing to compilers. We have some teams contributing to Java. However, the share of Russian development in these niches is significantly smaller than the share of Russia in global GDP.
А если
That's a pretty simple kind of metric. If our contribution to a particular segment is smaller than our contribution to global GDP percentage-wise, that's something to worry about. Please raise your hands if you have any questions.
В последнее время начали появляться события, как, например, случай с компанией Baikal Electronics, которая вносила...
Have you heard that case of Baikal Electronics, which made a patch for the Linux kernel?
Будет улучшать совместимость архитектуры.
So it was designed to increase compatibility of Baikal architecture with Linux.
И причем
However, that patch
компанию
was rejected and the whole company was banned.
можно наблюдать будет такую тенденцию, что российские компании
I am wondering if it will form a trend. There are other Russian companies
проекты, как и Linux,
sort of seeing themselves as open source
хотят их
software developers behind Linux or eBSD or whatever.
из-за того, что есть центральный вендор у этих продуктов.
Well, as long as there are central vendors
Можно форкнуть,
for these products,
вот.
there may be some barriers. Well, naturally, projects can be forked, but I am wondering if there is a compromise here. Like, when would you go for a fork, and when would you try to go for a global commit?
Вернее, слушайте, значит, эта история все-таки пока
Hey, listen,
единичный случай.
it's a one-off case, okay?
Вот.
Or at least there have been very few cases like this.
друг, он мейнтейнер, значит, такой достаточно существенной части ядра Linux.
Now, the maintainer of this important...
Кичинский его зовут.
Oh, right, Jakub Kaczynski is the name. So he maintains a significant portion of Linux core. I don't think he has had much of a following in this respect.
Ядро Linux таки
In fact,
принимается.
lots of Russian patches are now being accepted to Linux kernel.
Сетевых.
So I do hope it's
Именно возненавидел.
a one-off case.
Понятно, я этот
I don't really know why he decided to hate Baikal. I've done some reading about it. I didn't really see anything that Baikal people said that would deserve banning the whole company.
международном
I guess Jakub overreacted.
эту тему в разных блогах, в том числе утверждает,
And they have been numerous posts
нельзя, потому что
on the internet, and
их не догоним.
lots of people even wrote that you shouldn't do that because if you do that, Russians will fork Linux and will get ahead of us, which is a funny thing to think.
Значит, того, что
I mean,
оттуда, и то, что сделали вы, если, конечно, вы реально что-то сделали.
that would sort of defeat much of the purpose of Linux. The amount of merge happening on Linux is colossal.
Фотки делайте отлично.
As you're developing your own things, and other companies are doing the same.
На самом деле, конечно, вряд ли русские даже вместе с китайцами
So I don't think that Russians, even if they join hands with the Chinese, can be the whole world
В общем,
to developing Linux on their own fork.
Якубу так с
But I think that the general opinion of the community about what Jakub did has been cautious disapproval. I don't think it's a trend. Although I see what you mean. I mean, it's not totally off the cards.
Я бы хотел ответить на вопрос про форки. Вообще, зачем нужны форки?
Let me answer this question about forks and whether you need to fork and what would be the right conditions for forking.
Форкать не нужно.
I believe
Это
we shouldn't go for a fork.
болезненная, дорогостоящая вещь.
I think that forking is a very painful, a very expensive move,
Скорее амбиции людей, чем
and very often forks represent ambitions of individuals rather than real project needs.
того, что это очень дорого стоит это развивать.
It may cost quite a lot to develop your own system.
Фрагментация
Moreover, it leads to fragmentation.
это все-таки огромный мыслительный
Any piece of software represents a lot of thinking.
глобального компьютера, который представляет
And as you fork, you fragment the global computer, if I can use this metaphor for the humankind,
сказать, что
with the humankind involved in software development.
очень
I actually think that open source is still in its infancy.
в культуре и в
Culturally,
правилах и в определении
in terms of our rules, in terms of how we set new rules,
такая российская
we are looking
русская
westward a lot. I think that the Soviet culture, the Russian culture, is that of mutual support.
именно в мире open source.
And I think it has got a lot to say in the world of open source. I mean, it is such a, shall I say, Soviet thing to do something free of charge and share it with people like yourselves.
Уже за счет того, что огромное количество российских разработчиков участвует,
There are so many Russian developers engaged in it.
которые, ну,
And I think the culture here can be an important
это двигать не только
factor. We
на Запад
embody this culture,
клином не сошелся. Вот.
and we can take it to the West, or we can take it to the East. After all, there are other parts of the world.
Вот Константин говорит, что форки не нужны, а я скажу,
So Konstantin says forks are necessary or even bad, but I will disagree with that. In the Postgres world, there are dozens of forks. Some are useful, others are useless. Yes, we have developed our own fork, and it is quite expensive. But in our case, there was a technological necessity for it.
оказывается, ты можешь использоваться раньше, чем
If you have developed something new,
говорить. Вот, мы
you can actually use it ahead of the whole community if you have the capacity. We keep sending patches a lot to the community,
поступают
but some patches we keep to our own fork, and this is done by numerous companies around the world.
скажем так, не закрытых, не тупиков.
So this is it about forks which are not dead ends. Dead end forks are obviously bad.
Одной из форм просто жизни
So I think
open source.
it could be a kind of, an avenue for development of the open source community. More questions?
Мы на корабле. У матросов нет вопросов.
We must be on a ship. There is a Russian saying, sailors never have questions.
А где наш ведущий?
And do we have a moderator to help us?
Ну, мы еще можем посидеть, если что.
No problem. We can still sit here and chit-chat.
Да, коллеги, просто ведущий ушел, он как-то...
Yeah, I'm afraid Sergey has had to leave, so we can wrap up.
Если кто-то хочет посидеть...
Well, the organizers have paid for 18 extra minutes, so you can still stay here if you so choose. But I suggest we wrap this session up. Thank you very much for being with us today. See you tomorrow. Let me offer my apologies for the technical hiccups we experienced during the day. There were 4 hiccups more than we expected.